Good afternoon, everyone. I'm still going to give us another minute while we wait for working group members to sign on. We'll be starting at around 1:03, 1:04. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rosa Mendez. I'm the Director of the Office for Environmental Justice at New York DEC. Welcome to today's Climate Justice Working Group meeting. Alana is going to go ahead and switch to our PowerPoint for today. Great, thank you, Alana. Just a couple of reminders, Alana, you can advance to the next slide. Housekeeping items for our meetings. Make sure that you are muted when you are not speaking. And if you are a working group member and you have video available today, we would love to see your faces and have you on video for today. If you have any comments or questions and I don't see you waving in your video box, just put a note in the chat box that you have a comment or question and I'll read it out or call on you. Next slide, please, Alana. Great, and on behalf of Commissioner Sagos, I want to welcome everyone. He likes to attend these meetings, but he couldn't be here today, and he wanted me to pass on his continuing appreciation for the work this working group is doing for New York. And we'll go ahead and start our roll call. And start with Amy, are you on?
Yes, I'm on.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, I just want to let you know our internet is going in and out, so I might lose you at some point.
Okay, great, thanks. And do we have Elizabeth?
Hi, Elizabeth, present.
Hi, good afternoon. And And Rawa, are you on today?
Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you.
Hi, Rawa. Next is Eddie Bautista on. Okay, next do we have Abigail?
Present. I'm glad to be here.
Good to see you. And Donathan, are you on?
I certainly am. Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon. Jared?
Yes, here. Good afternoon, folks.
And I have a note that Sonal is having trouble getting on. Sonal, if you don't mind trying to sign back in, I'll elevate you to panelist.
Eddie said he's also muted, that he's on, but he
Okay.
can't be heard.
All right, so I'll try to bump them up to panelists because I think I see them in the list. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Howdy.
Thanks. And moving on, I know Mary Beth could not join us today. Do we have Neil?
Yes.
So about,
Yep.
Hi, Neil. And Joe McNerney, are you on today?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, I'm here.
Great. And Chris Cole.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone.
Great, thanks to see you. Good to see you. And Sonal, I see you in the attendees, and I'm trying to bump you up, but it might help if you sign off and sign back in. All right, that's our roll call, and hopefully we can get Sonal's audio working. Also with us today, we have participation from Illum. So anyone from Illum, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, Alex Dunn is here.
Hi, Alex.
Amanda Dwelly from Illum.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And today from the EJ office, we also have Alana. Alana, you want to give yourself an introduction?
Hi, I'm Alana Cadell-Tucky. I am the kind of public affairs and outreach person for the Office of Environmental Justice. Usually I'm on mute taking notes, but today I will be manning the PowerPoint. Feel free to get in touch with you with any questions you might have.
Thanks, Alana. And Sonal, I think you can unmute yourself now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, great, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Alana, can you move to the next slide, please? Great, we'll quickly go over our agenda for today. We'll handle some business items, and then we're gonna have engagement with the Waste Advisory Panel. They are the one panel we did not have a chance to have our early engagement with at our last meeting. And then for the bulk of today's meeting, we'll be going over the evaluation rubric again and its initial application to the universe of indicators that we have put together. Next slide, please. But first, we wanted to go over our last meeting. I know it's been over a month since the last time we met. We last met as a group on December 16th. And at that meeting, we went through one example with the evaluation rubric, and we talked about the structure and some of the terminology in it. We also heard from the Just Transition Working Group and a bunch of advisory panels, including energy efficiency and housing, agriculture and forestry, power generation, and the energy intensive industries and trade exposed panel. There was a lot of great conversation during that meeting. And I know that the advisory panels are looking for follow-up engagement with this group, and that's something that we're going to work to put together. We also sent around the draft of the meeting minutes from December 16th. I have not received any suggested edits to date. Does any working group member want to open discussion on the draft minutes from 12/16? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone.
Hey, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Hi, it's not an edit, it's just, I guess, a follow-up question. One of the questions we had asked was how, with disadvantaged communities, how our definition would affect the DEC's EJ area framework. And the response was that you're working this out with CP 29 revisions. I was just wondering if maybe we can talk about it later in the meeting, but just wondering if there's any updates to that.
Thanks, Eddie. And if that's not reflected in the minutes, I'll make sure to include that as a point for follow-up. We are still internally talking about it. I think we'll be in a better position to evaluate that when we see the list of indicators getting closer to finalization, because right now there's a lot that we are still talking about, and I don't want to make an assumption on where we're heading at this point.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other comments or edits on the minutes from 12/16? All right, not seeing any. So does anyone want to move to vote to approve the minutes as final?
Rosa,
So moved.
Rosa, sorry, one quick thing. I apologize. My sense of time, I think this was the last minutes I reviewed, but again, like December feels like it was eons ago. But I seem to remember when I was looking at the minutes, my one concern was that the minutes do a good job of capturing what questions come up in these meetings, but there's a little less on what the answers were. And I know for myself, again, I'm taking notes, but from 1 month to the next, having more detailed information on that, what were the responses to the questions that were raised would be really helpful for just, catching up to speed on a month-to-month basis.
Okay, great. Thank you, Abby. I'll note that, and when we go through the recordings, I'll make sure that we're capturing the responses as detailed as we're capturing your questions and your input.
Thank you so much.
So we had Eddie move to approve the minutes. Any seconds?
Second.
Thanks. And for today, I thought we could use the feedback feature for this vote. So if you'll look towards the right under where you see participants, there's a little megaphone there, and you'll have options including the word yes and the word no. So if you could right now indicate your vote on moving the minutes to final using that function, please.
Function, could you point out?
Yeah, it's a little megaphone on the right-hand side. And then when you click yes or no, I'll be able to see it. Great, and looks like we have all yeses, so we will move the minutes as final. Thank you, everyone. And Alana, can you move us to the next slide? Great. I also wanted to quickly check in on our work plan. This is something that we started doing so that everyone knows where we are in the process and we can remind ourselves of our targets for goals as a work group. So on the screen, you'll see there's a snippet of the work plan, and next to it, I included a new item. This is a list of, we call them tasks or steps of how we can get to the goal that's indicated in the work plan. So for January, you'll see that we initially wanted to have a discussion on interim feedback for the advisory panels. On 12/16, we decided to move that to February. So you'll see in February, I've moved engagement with the panels there. And we also had, for a discussion topic for our January meetings, to continue discussions on the draft list of indicators, which we are doing today using that evaluation rubric and talking about the application of that rubric to the list. So for example, in the tasks on the side, you'll see related to identify potential indicators and data sources. There are steps about finding those data sources and engaging with state agencies on data. So a lot of these tasks and steps are things that the state staff team is working on. And you'll also see that there's things in there where we're making sure that the working group during our meetings is giving what they want to see as an indicator for the state team to then look for data sources. And if you have a data source identified, those are things we're also pulling from. So for February, from the work plan, our goal was to finalize the draft criteria. And we also wanted to start talking about strategies for our public engagement. How are we going to host the public sessions so that the public is getting engaged with the criteria and this process as well? Those are still things we are teed up to do in February, and you'll see I circled the step on the task list of getting to consensus on the preliminary indicators to use for analysis. And that's where the evaluation rubric and these conversations come in so that we can meet that goal that we had for February. I want to pause there to see if anyone wants to bring up discussion on the current work plan or the tasks and steps that we've identified as part of meeting the goals of that work plan.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So when we talk about data sources, one of the things we talked about in the previous meeting was the lack of New York State's compilation of manufacturing zoned land. I mean, we understand that these are local zoning decisions, but the state, it's the kind of data that's easily compilable. And I was under the impression that I don't know if it was Department of State or DC was going to ask Department of State, but that is a critical data source point when we talk about disadvantaged communities and the application of indicators in the rubric. So how do we access that data source? The state working to compile where all the manufacturing zoned land is in the state so that we can, I mean, it's a key data source point that only the state can really compile and should be able to do so without a whole lot of, bells and whistles. But do you have any sense for us, how Chris, any of you guys, about what the status of that particular data source collection is?
Sure. I don't know the exact step on where we are on that. We are having one-on-one sessions with all the agencies to talk about what data they currently have. And there you'll see on one of the Excel sheets we put together with the draft list of indicators where we've identified what we have to do to get to a data source that would be reliable or that covers more of the state. So that's included on the list of things that we're working on with other agencies.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. And
hey, Rosa.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, this is Chris. Cole, so the other thing, we did talk to a couple of the agencies, and I think it was HCR who at the last meeting said that they might have some of this data. It turns out that because every county collects the information differently, it's in a much kind of in a dispersed kind of format. So we have some more work to do kind of with other state agencies to figure out how to pull it all together, but it's on our priority list.
Thanks. One last point about that, Chris.
I'm sorry.
One last point about that. Department of State, I think also maintains a database of brownfield sites that might help in terms of compiling, because so many brownfield sites are in manufacturing areas. So, sorry, Elizabeth, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No, I was about to mention the brownfields and also get a sense of the timeline. I mean, priority is one thing, but what is the timeline? By when do you expect the agencies to respond to you about this data? And are you also reaching out to communities that may be able to help populate the data bank with information about uses that may be toxic?
So we have, so I guess for, just for awareness, in case we didn't raise it previously, we have a meeting every 2 weeks with the state agencies that are, you know, involved in supporting this work. So, you know, we're working on individual discussions with those agencies now to happen before the middle of February to understand what additional data they have available to support this. We haven't talked about kind of, you know, collecting data from the communities though, Elizabeth. So, you know, wanting to start with kind of what's available and what could be kind of, you know, more easily kind of rolled into the analysis here. But, you know, I think once we identify where the gaps are, you know, from the available state data, we'll have to think about how to, you know, bring in other data source or insights.
Thank you. I think that this has got to be a priority for us if we're thinking about how you operationalize a just transition or take advantage of the CLCPA, or what is going to be offered from a national for a federal perspective. We're going to need to be able to map it and think about what an economy looks like that moves us to that just transition. And so the sooner we get it, the better. We can start working on that, but this is really cool. Thank you so much, Chris.
All right, thank you, Chris. I'm gonna move us, we'll come back to the work plan check-in because I noted the time and I know that some of the members of the waste advisory panel have to jump a little early. So Alana, if you can just move us 2 slides over, I think it is. And I'll introduce Martin Brand from DEC. Martin, will you give yourself an introduction and take it away for our waste advisory panel engagement?
Thank you, Rosa. Appreciate it. Can everyone hear me? Somebody give me a thumbs up. I'll be good. Thank you. My name is Martin Brand, Deputy Commissioner for a number of the regulatory programs here at DEC, including the remediation programs, materials management, oil and gas mining spills, and heavily engaged in water quality issues and response around the state as well. So happy to be with you this afternoon. I can give a very high level kind of quick summary of where we are with the waste panel and kind of what we're looking at. I am joined today here with several of the waste panel members, so they can certainly chime in as we go to the discussion phase. And as Rosa noted, we do have a waste panel meeting of our own at 2 o'clock, so we'll try to do this quickly so we can get out and get set up for that. So the waste panel was set up a little bit later than some of the other advisory panels, probably about 2 months or so later than the others. We've been working very hard to catch up, and thankfully the panel members are extremely engaged and diligent, and they've been very generous with their time and their efforts and energy to work on the various policies and strategies that we are considering that will really focus on reductions in methane and greenhouse gas emissions around the state relative to our solid waste management infrastructure in the state. So we've had 4 full panel meetings to date. The 5th one will be this afternoon. We have a couple more scheduled for next month and then into March. We created, like many of the other panels, we created some sub-panel working groups really to focus on the strategies and dive down into the details of the recommendations. So they've been working very hard, and many of the sub-panels have had several meetings and have really done great work to really dive into the work. We've had some cross-panel engagement with some of the other panels. As you all know, there's a number of cross-cutting issues that come to light as we do this work. So we've been engaged with a number of other panels to be aware of what they're evaluating and to share some of the information and some of the ideas that we have. And we'll be, like many of the panels, we'll be having some public meeting engagement here probably next month as part of one of our meetings. I'll just really quickly touch on kind of the big buckets that we're looking at. So the subpanels are sort of divided up into a number of big categories. So we're looking at landfills and solid waste management facilities, and then some of the diversion ideas that we have to reduce landfilling of waste, and especially methane producing waste. We have a group that's looking at local scale waste management in the state, as well as there's sort of the group that's taking a little sharper look at some of the equity considerations and helping the other sub panels in those areas. We're also looking at a number of waste reduction strategies to enhance recycling and actually again reduce waste from being generated in the first place. We're looking at really a deep dive into the what was traditionally known as wastewater treatment facilities, but really trying to transform the idea of wastewater treatment into a water resource recovery type facilities to take advantage of some of the products, whether it's potential energy production or generation of other products that can be used beneficially. So our local waste diversion group is really looking at some community-based solutions to really capture and divert waste from the waste stream. We're looking at a number of different models in New York City and elsewhere that have done really great job at the grassroots level. So we're looking at the one to reduce exposure to waste management and impacted communities. Obviously reduce again those methane producing wastes, but look at good green jobs, local engagement, local educational opportunities. So they've done a lot of great work looking into things like waste collection and processing, composting, those type of things around the state. We're looking at as I mentioned, a number of waste reduction strategies. So we're looking to expand what we call extended producer responsibility and product stewardship programs, which are sort of your classic take back programs where the manufacturers and vendors actually manage those wastes rather than getting into the waste stream. So it's a way of diverting material away from landfills, but also shifting some of the burden, some of the cost away from municipalities and localities back onto the responsibility of the product manufacturing. We're looking at that as well as a number of enhanced recycling programs, whether that's just incentives to continue to increase our waste diversion from landfill and our recycling rates, but and also other programs really to really capture some of those difficult waste products that either produce methane or else are just difficult for municipalities to handle. So we have a number of those programs underway right at the moment. A big one is organic waste diversion from landfills. Organic waste really is the biggest bucket for us in terms of methane emissions. So we're looking at things like expanded food donation programs, food waste reduction, food scraps recycling strategies. And actually, as we just came on the meeting today, we just announced that we're putting out our draft regulations for the food scraps implementation for the law that was passed last year and that takes effect in January 2022. But we certainly see opportunities there to enhance that program and capture more of that very large waste stream that's represented by food waste and organics. We're looking at some nuts and bolts things as well. So we're looking at fugitive emissions of methane and greenhouse gases from landfills and other waste management facilities. So we're looking at a number of either regulatory or technology-based programs to capture as much of those gas emissions from waste facilities. One, just to limit the emissions in general, but also to find beneficial uses, whether it's energy production or those type of things from those facilities. And the same thing for the traditional wastewater treatment facilities. We're looking at programs to really capture fugitive emissions of methanes there, but also to promote programs like anaerobic digestion, for example, that might generate energy, and looking some opportunities there to make it really a local-based program. So whether it's a co-location of these anaerobic digestion systems or providing energy for cogeneration or local use. And again, we're looking at other products that come out of the water resource recovery facilities. So whether it's an increased diversion of biosolids away from landfills, which can help with methane emissions, carbon sequestration, offset fertilizer use of soil amendments, and increase composting as we go forward. So I don't want to spend too much more time because I know our time is short. I want to leave time for discussion. In terms of equity considerations and all that, we're we're in the phase here where we're really defining some of these recommendations. Certainly, we're looking at all of these potential policy programs through the lens of climate justice and disadvantaged communities. We're just kind of starting to do that dive in there. We certainly intend to devote at least one of our upcoming meetings really to focus on those equity considerations as we refine our recommendations that'll eventually go to the Climate Action Council. So, so I think I'll stop there maybe with the overall program that we're looking at, and we can have a discussion or take questions or hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Martin. All right, Eddie, you have a question.
Actually, I have a couple, but I'm also mindful about how much space I'm taking. So if you could come back to me, I want to give others the opportunity to ask questions, make comments, but I do have a couple.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Well, I'm not seeing any in the chat, Eddie, so why don't you go ahead with yours and maybe others will chime in after.
Great, thank you. Is it Deputy Commissioner Brand? I'm sorry, I missed the title in the beginning.
Yes, Deputy Commissioner.
Hi. A couple of quick questions. One is, I think I know the answer to this. I just need to have it reinforced. Considering that solid waste is one of the major export functions in New York, are we, the millions of tons that we export out of state for out of state landfills and incinerators, is the carbon footprint of that export attributed to New York State, or are the states that receive our garbage, is that part of their greenhouse gas inventory?
Well, the short answer is yes, we have to account for the waste that we generate and goes off out of state. So if it goes out to an out of state disposal facility or landfill, we certainly have to, in our accounting, have to take that into consideration as well. So it's just not, I guess the technical term is leakage, but we don't like to say leakage because we get confused when we're talking about fugitive waste emissions versus leakage from an actual facility. But we do have to account for that. So, we have good data on how much of that waste is exported. As we get into some of the waste reduction strategies, we'll also have to take that into account. So if we're making changes either through EPR programs or product stewardship that results in manufacturing changes, say from an out-of-state producer, we'll also have to take that into account as we move forward. So we want to make sure we understand the consequences, obviously, of any proposals that we make for New York State and how that affects where the waste where it goes. So it all counts, if you will. So all that, like you say, from New York City in particular, that goes to Pennsylvania, other states all over, we do have to account for that.
Thank you. And another question I had was, and you alluded to it, so I was looking for some greater clarity. Has the opposition or deeply troubling position that forms of incineration that are euphemistically called waste to energy, like gasification, plasma arc, pyrolysis, have those technologies come up as part of the technologies that you guys are considering? And have you all understood how deeply troubling that prospect is to EJ communities? Because as you're probably aware, you can only site those types of facilities in manufacturing zones. Hence the original question that we've been asking repeatedly, which is, what is the manufacturing zone land in New York State? Because if you map racial and income overlays on the manufacturing zones, I would guarantee you that most of the people that live in or near manufacturing areas are low-income people, people of color, et cetera. So by definition, those kinds of technologies can only be cited in manufacturing zone lands, redirecting them to our communities. And the technology that plasma arc, that gasification, at the end of the day, a lot of us consider that a form of incineration. You are basically, you're burning off the gas that gets produced. So, you know, it's an issue that we have had ongoing problems with. I mean, we were able to luckily stop incineration from being considered a renewable energy source years back, but it keeps coming up. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the CLCPA, as part of the offsets down the line, you know, incineration and those kinds of uses are not going to be allowed. So, you know, how you guys are processing waste to energy vis-a-vis, you know, these technologies, when for us, anaerobic digestion is a form of waste to energy that we can support, the others not so much. I'm just wondering how you guys are processing those contradictions. Oh, we can't hear you.
Went the other way. So used to being off mute, I muted myself. Certainly waste to energy is a large part of the current solid waste management infrastructure, and it's something that we have to consider as we go forward to make sure that, you know, in addition to reducing methane emissions and worrying about impacts on host communities, we also have to make sure that we have a functioning and accessible solid waste management program in the state so people can make good use of that. We have not really dived down into any recommendations that are focused on waste to energy. So we don't have anything that's proposing additional waste to energy at this point. Probably will not, but it's certainly we're considering as we go forward. But I think one of the larger questions that you raised is sort of the siting issue, right? So one reason we set up this local scale, small scale sub-panel is to really look at some opportunities there to handle the waste on a small scale, local scale. So we can divert some of that waste away from large scale industrial facilities or even large scale regional facilities. Not saying that some of the materials in the state, whether it's agricultural wastes or other organic waste, might benefit from a regional approach, but certainly we want to make sure that we're taking a hard look at some of the siting issues. As you know, solid waste management facilities, you know, in the past were predominantly located in disadvantaged communities. So we're taking a hard look at that as we go forward to certainly do this with a sensitivity to local impacts.
Martin, this is Steve Changaris, and it was good to hear, Mr. Batista, your comments about anaerobic digestion. But I think maybe, and it's one of these granular issues that we really haven't drilled down into on the waste panel, but seeing it on, I think, one of your earlier slides of your working group, it has to do with as we change the way we consider the permitting of these things, and you create the new zones, whether they be from the manufacturing, commercial zones, industrial zones into towns, or into the statistical areas for the air emissions and the census tracts and the like. It's going to be really important to use the kind of framework Martin talked about, the local impact, because as a facility developer tries to develop an anaerobic digester, he or she or the company is going to need to know, are they tripping those wires and unduly burdening these overly impacted areas going forward. So there's a lot of settlement that has to be done with the framework and to know the swim lanes. And, you know, we're very anxious to have those discussions and try to get that all hammered out, because, you know, there will be projects that I anticipate from the industrial sector coming forward, seeking to build anaerobic digestion capacity to handle that 30% or so fragment of the organic stream that is heretofore been just simply disposed or shipped out of state, what have you. So I think that's a fertile area for these two panels to collaborate on.
This is Lauren Toretta, also on the waste panel and with CH4 biogas, and I'm a co-lead on the organics and landfill piece, and we've spent a good deal of time talking about this and about you know, hauling considerations in relation to doing this, and also the opportunities to use best in class technologies and applying a multitude of technologies to address the waste needs, particularly as we think about further organics diversion and management. We need the infrastructure in place to be able to serve that. And there's a lot of technologies that are not currently being deployed that could be deployed that would help to improve all the related odor issues and any types of negative impacts on communities. So we want to create a framework where we have the best in class technologies, which creates a much better universal environment.
Just one quick response. That's all fair, but let's be clear that plasma arc, pyrolysis, gasification have all at one point or other been touted as the new technology that's going to take care of this. And, technologies are, I'm not a Luddite, all right? So I want to be clear about that. But we also need to be careful that when we talk about untested or technologies that the markets are still grappling with, that, when we cite or pilot these, again, given the manufacturer, the zoning limitations that such uses, naturally invite, right? Those limitations, those means that these pilots and the testing generally fall on EJ shoulders. And one of the things that, good, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I agree with you, and none of our discussion has been about piloting new technologies. And we really haven't even addressed those technologies that you're raised as the most concerning. We've really just been focusing on opportunities to compost, landfill, and anaerobic digestion, and those have proven technologies. And there are ways to upgrade that other states and particularly Europe has really pushed further than the U.S. in sort of evolving those and managing. Their space constraints have forced them further ahead. So that's really been our focus. But certainly the concerns you raise are real ones, and appreciate you bringing them up.
And one last point about Europe, because when technologies get raised, Europe is almost always trotted out. I do have to say one thing. One of the reasons that Europe has a different experience when it comes to these kind of technologies is because their recycling rates are through the roof compared to us. So they're not dealing with mixed solid waste. They're dealing with much cleaner streams of waste to then run through these technologies. So let's be clear that, if New York could get closer to 30, 40, 50% recycling, which in Europe, that's a low amount of recycling, then we're talking apples to apples comparison. But I appreciate everything you said. Thank you.
No, Eddie, thank you for that. You should be joining our group. You're really hitting on all the topics. Thank you.
I've done my waste time.
There's always room for more.
And Martin, we have Abigail with a question.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this discussion and, you guys being here today to talk to us about your work. First, just a comment and then a question. I really do appreciate that the intention is to take responsibility for our impact on other states. And I would just want to, make sure that is broadly defined, not just in terms of carbon emissions, but, kind of a lot of what Eddie was just mentioning, that what is the impact on communities where our waste is going, even if they're not out of state. I would hope we would set a pretty high bar there. So that was the quick comment. The quick question, I'm wondering how your work integrates with some of what's already happening in the state with the plastic bag ban and styrofoam, and what other, you mentioned that waste reduction overall is a strategy you're looking at. So what other opportunities are there? Where does regulation come in with that? What might you be thinking of that's outside of the box?
Yeah, well, obviously we're still refining, some of the areas that we want to go into. But I think what we've talked about so far, at least in the waste reduction realm, whether it's enhanced recycling, whether it's extended producer responsibility, product stewardship, additional organic diversion, I think it's all complementary with programs that are already in play in New York or coming online. I just mentioned the food scraps regulations that are going out for comment now, but there's certainly opportunities within existing programs to enhance those programs, make them more comprehensive, more expansive, capture more of the waste stream. And certainly there's a room for regulations there or statutes that we might need. For example, and I think Steve mentioned a minute ago that there's never really been a source separation rule for, say, food waste and organic waste, that type of thing, that the food scraps regs that we just put out our first step in that direction. But so there's certainly a room there for additional regulation or statute going down to really put that stable foundation under some of these programs, and allow us to do some enforcement as well if we need to. So I think what we're proposing is pretty complementary. We're trying to reflect it back to what Eddie was talking about, and Steve, really reflect the solid waste hierarchy in New York, where we try to reduce waste where we can, not create the waste in the first place, and then move our way down from the more preferable waste management techniques and programs down to less desirable, with landfilling being, at the bottom, sort of the bottom of the hierarchy. So I think there's good linkage to existing programs, but we're certainly looking at other ways that we can find additional opportunity, and that might require legislative change or regulatory changes as we go.
Martin, can I jump in here? I think Abigail really specifically, I mean, he really covered everything at the high level. But there was a great New York Times article today on Senator Kaminsky and Assemblyman Engelbright's legislation and extended producer responsibility. We think this EPR has legs for shifting that responsibility away from municipalities for managing the waste further upstream, so that there's more skin in the game for the producers, and we can get to a more sustainable material management system by shifting that responsibility up. And I think that's real game for this legislative session.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up question on that? I'm thinking you're kind of up here at the industrial level a little more, and I'm wondering kind of at the household level, for example, food scraps. Mm-hmm. What do you envision programmatically that would make sure that there's equitable access even to being able to compost? Because I know, right here in our community, if you want to compost, you got to pay for it, and it's expensive. And so in terms of making that accessible, and also what would be the education piece that would complement that to help people, engage in responsible management of their household waste?
Sure. Well, those are all good areas to look at. We are looking at that. Our sub-panel, our local scale group, is really looking at some of those programs, some of those models that are in place or have been piloted in places like some of the work the Inner City Green Team has done, for example, in New York City. There's a number of programs, at the local level. So we're looking into that to really make some of these programs really accessible. Accessibility, convenience really leads to good performance at the end. We've seen that in the recycling programs, that if the recycle bin is there, people use it. If it's not there, you lose performance there. So we're looking at a number of those local scale things, but there's certainly things that can be done statewide as well as we apply for, whether it's additional source separation regulations. But again, some of the assistance we've done around the state over the years, using the funding we have to enhance recycling rates, increase outreach education. We funded educational coordinators in a number of communities over the years. We have a very robust Recycle Right educational program that's in place right now, but certainly there's always opportunities to enhance those programs and really increase the performance of our source separation programs around the state.
Martin, if I could just add, this is Risa Domino. I'm also a member of the Waste Panel, and to connect back to what Dareth mentioned, on the EPR for packaging front, the Kaminsky bill would require equitable access to recycling programs throughout the state. So whether you're in single family, multifamily, no matter what community you're in, you'd get access to recycling of packaging and printed paper. And those costs would be borne by the brands and producers. And what that would do is free up those public sector dollars to move into composting and organics, both from the state grant level and from the municipal level, because all the funding they're now putting into curbside recycling and education around that could be available then for organics and other recovery. So in the big picture, I think it moves us in that direction. And I think if you look, we're trying to take a very broad view of the materials management recommendations in particular, so that there are legislative recommendations, there are regulatory recommendations, there are policy and program recommendations. There's a host of things that can be done by different entities at different levels of government, public and private sector to help move things forward. So hopefully it'll be a good sort of rounded set of recommendations that can be move in the direction whether or not we get the legislative victories immediately. Although I agree with Dareth that we have a unique moment in time and we should strike on it.
So Rosa, this is Martin. We could talk all day on this, and we're about to actually talk for a couple more hours in our waste panel. So I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity for me and the other panel members to talk with your group. We could come back. We could do some cross-panel discussions at another time. We'd certainly welcome that, and it would be helpful to us as we go forward. But I think at this point we might have to break and all of us sign off and get back on our next waste panel meeting here in a few minutes.
Deputy Commissioner, if I can, hello?
Yeah, go ahead, Eddie.
Before you leave, I just want to see if you can take 3 questions with you into that group, right? One is if you guys can let us know at some future point how you're able to measure the amount of methane coming from landfills and incinerators. The second question is whether, and I'd like the thoughtfulness about organics. Have you all talked or thought about the idea of actually banning organics that get sent to landfills and incinerators as part of the approach? And finally, there is a key state function that has not been borne out that's key to New York City's solid waste management plan. The state was supposed to match the city's capital investment to reopen something called the Gansevoort Marine Transfer Station to handle Manhattan's metal, glass, and plastic, most of which goes to be handled in the South Bronx. So we would love for the state to revisit this now 16-year-old unfinished, unmet commitment that the state made to help underwrite the opening the Gansevoort Marine Transfer Station. Those are my 3 items, and thank you for your patience.
Before you leave, and this has been great, this is Raul. I'm going to add one other thing to take back to your conversation, and thank you so much. You guys have been amazing. And what are the workforce opportunities, especially as we think about historically disadvantaged communities in waste management, opportunities for composting, and ways for municipalities to also generate revenue? Thank you.
No, thank you. We'll take those back, and certainly those questions we've been discussing, not specifically with the Gansevoort facility, but we'll take a look at that. So thank you much.
Very helpful, folks.
Thank you all for coming to our meeting today to talk about the Waste Advisory Panel. I'll just note that we are seeking to coordinate follow-up engagement with all the advisory panels. So I'll be reaching out to Martin to help with that. And at this point, since we're talking about further engagement with advisory panels, I know we have Jared Snyder on. And Jared, did you want to jump in with an opportunity for engagement with transportation panel?
Sure. Thanks, Rawa. I mean, Rosa. Sorry. Thanks, Rosa. So we had a meeting like this a couple of months ago. Our thinking has progressed. You know, we have been considering climate justice and environmental justice priorities in the transportation panel. But what we would like to have another conversation, and you know, what I'd like to propose this time is that, you know, we invite members of the Climate Justice Working Group to come and join us for part of a transportation advisory panel meeting, at which you can, you know, identify what some of your priorities are. Let us know what your ideas are for structuring strategies, clean transportation strategies in a way to bring benefits to disadvantaged communities. And if you come to our meeting, then that's an opportunity that everybody on our panel hears the perspective. So, you know, I'd like to extend that invitation. We have upcoming meetings on February 10th and February 18th. The 10th is at 3 to 5, the 18th is 11 to 1. And I think maybe after this, Rosa, if you could, poll the group and see what works best. You don't all have to come, but it would be good to hear a diverse perspective, both upstate, downstate, rural, urban, to make sure we're getting all the viewpoints. So any questions about that?
Yeah, I have one.
All right.
Anyone else, or I don't want to keep speaking. I'm sorry, guys. Does anyone else have a question for Jared?
Right. Well, you're on, Eddie.
It's not a quick one, Jared. So I'm a little concerned about the last public session that happened. The way I and many of us processed it was that there appeared to be pushback on a study that has been a seminal study that a lot of us have been relying in terms of policy analysis and recommendations in terms of the disproportionate emissions burdens that communities of color are facing under cap and trade systems. The way the talk was set up, it didn't give the author of that study sufficient time to deconstruct competing studies that are trying to undermine. And what was even clear, even in the short time that Manuel Pastor had, it was clear that the studies that folks were trotting out in that session to debunk the emissions disparities for communities of color was wrong. Like some of that study's assumptions were wrong. That makes me now wonder how much the Transportation Committee is going to be swayed by competing studies that undermine an EJ-CJ argument and that do so inaccurately. So for example, conversations like Transportation and Climate Initiative, if people start questioning whether in fact the studies have shown that in fact there's a disparity, we have a real problem. And so I'm just wondering how you all are going to try to disabuse members of the Transportation Committee who may be swayed by some of those attacks on the initial study that turns out that they were incorrect.
Okay, Eddie, I have the first conversation. That was a roundtable on market-based and financing policies, and I'm meeting with the subgroup on market-based and financing policies on Friday, and I'll raise that question. I mean, frankly, I thought that Manuel Pastor did a very good job of presenting his position. The fact is that somebody from the California Air Resources Board had a different perspective.
Exactly.
But I thought it was a fair debate. What I'm really interested in is getting beyond.
How fair was it? It was 1 against 5. I mean, there were a lot of. There was CAR, but there were private. There were hedge fund people it wasn't fair. It was, you had one person just questioning a carbon market trading system, and you had other people buying into it. So I don't see how that's fair, to be candid, Jared.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think a lot of those private sector people were focused on financing strategies and not cap and trade and invest.
Which is the financing strategy.
No, I mean, financing strategies like, how to get private capital engaged in the kind of transformation we need, so it's not all government money paying for that.
TCI would not be, right?
Pardon?
TCI would not be government money.
Well, if we were to do TCI, the proceeds from TCI would be public money to be invested. And the question is,
right, but it's not generated by the government. It's collected by the government. It's not government money. It's private money that the government what I'm saying. Like,
I mean, isn't that where all public money comes from? It's all raised from the public or regulated entities or whoever. The government, state government can't print dollars. The federal government can.
Agreed, but I think we're talking past each other. Yeah. I think the point is that form of private money collection by the government was among the financing options that they were speaking positively about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so we'd like to hear the perspective, your perspective, the perspective of other members of the Climate Justice Working Group, and I mean, focusing on strategies other than transportation and climate initiative. I mean, we want to talk about electrification. We want to talk about electrification of trucks. How do we get those benefits in environmental justice communities? But electrification of light duty vehicles, instead of, people driving around in the suburbs with clean vehicles, how do we, get those benefits in disadvantaged communities? That's the kind of conversation we'd like to have.
Like economy-wide polluter penalty fees, for example.
That may be an idea, Eddie, but just on that point, when the panels are not to look at economy-wide programs. That's for the council itself. Certainly, this working group can make those recommendations to the council, and you absolutely can bring it up at our meeting. But yeah, I think we'll have a lot of things to talk about, Eddie.
Gotcha.
So any other questions for me or thoughts? Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Rosa.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat function. I do see a note that the Ag and Forestry panel also has some upcoming meetings that they are inviting this working group to participate in. So what we'll do as follow-up is I'll send the dates Jared mentioned to the working group and get the dates from Ag and Forestry, as well as Energy Efficiency and Housing, who also expressed the desire for follow-up at one of their meetings, and I'll send that around to the group. So thank you, Jared, for bringing that up.
All right, well, thank you.
And we have scheduled right now a 5-minute break. So looking at my clock, I have 2:03, so we'll come back at 2:08. All right, hopefully everybody is coming back from their 5-minute break. Okay, I see some cameras turned back on. Right, so it looks like everybody is coming back from the break. We have another break scheduled for later in our discussion. We are going to turn now to the discussion of the evaluation rubric and its application. And for that, I'm turning over to Dr. Alex Dunn.
I always do a double take every time I hear the doctor. It's just so weird. So I think we better do Alex before I like completely. But thank you. That's the most doctor honorifics I've heard. Okay, I'd like to share my screen. How? I don't have the ball.
I will pass you the ball.
I am now the presenter. Okay. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Hopefully you guys can all see all the things. And I'm actually sharing our giant task list with everyone. So hopefully you guys can all see that. All right, let me stop this and share the other screen so that you can see me talking directly to you, not. Okay, screen. Share. Screen.
So while you're doing that, just for clarity, everyone, what Alex is showing you is the large scale version of the snippets I had up during our work plan slides of the tasks and steps.
I'm going to overwhelm you all with the messiness of this. And in fact, actually today, what I'd really love from each of you is to just, we're not using PowerPoint. We're going to go through Excel. We're going to get messy. And part of that is I think it will really help us dive into some of the bigger decisions and really get into the meat of the thought process that we're trying to take. Some of you will recognize some of this because we have done some individual interviews, but not with everyone. So I would love to kind of take that approach with this whole group. That means please interrupt me, talk, ask questions. Rosa will help kind of monitor things on chat because I can't see that at all. And I wanted to show you this because, you know, we're kind of around here. So we've conducted some of the interviews and we've started to apply the rubric to the indicators that we have. And we have some results and things that I would really like to talk to you through. But there's also just, you know, a ton more that we have to do. As Elizabeth noted, you know, we've got to get going. And so we are trying to kind of run forward as much as we can, but there's some critical pieces that we need decisions on and from every single person and from this working group. So I just wanted to be as transparent as possible as far as like the thinking of what we're doing and the different steps. I'm happy to share this with you all so you can see what our thinking is as far as the steps. This is where, you know, we get to be like all nerdy about doing our statistics. The part where I really am looking forward to getting the working group feedback from is once we've gotten the indicators and we've started to do our analysis, then we start creating scenarios. And what I need from each of you is to give like, you know, validity to those scenarios being real with the knowledge that you have in the areas that you have. So if there are places where we're thinking this is likely to be a disadvantaged community or get a disadvantaged community designation, in this scenario, does that happen? And does that jive with what you know in the communities that you know? And that is, I think, one of the best ways we're going to quickly verify our approach and make it work. Any questions on this crazy spreadsheet? I know you haven't seen it, and you don't have to review it, but I wanted to show that there's a lot of work that is still not started, or we're starting to start it. But we're actually kind of at that pivot point where at this point we're going to apply the rubric, start downloading data and analyzing it. And that's when we really get the ball rolling.
Alex, what does the darker red color in the path?
Yeah, so in the critical pathways, it's almost like we need to get this step done before we can move on too far ahead. They're not like super bumped up critical path, but they're like, no, this really has to happen before we can get too far down the road on any other parts. So, you know, in this level, you know, get consensus on the preliminary indicators for the analysis. That's kind of where we're at. You know, we're going to apply the rubric and go through the data we have and start looking at them, and then, you know, start looking at the database and constructing the database to get all of you to say, okay, you're the way that we're approaching using the rubric and casting this wide net and starting to download those data. If we can get to the point where everyone here is comfortable with that today, then we can start really constructing this database, seeing where there are any missing, you know, any missing data points that we then need to like find somewhere else and still collate and bring in. And then we get to analyzing. Does that help answer, Abigail? Yeah. We are building this car as we're driving it. And in that sense, like, I think we're still, as Chris mentioned, we're still meeting with a bunch of groups to get data and know what data we can get, what is the best data that they have. And so it's kind of a moving piece. Some of the parts of the rubric where we have, you know, given it a score, those are subject to change a little bit, not a lot bit, but a little bit. And it's important for us to try to kind of keep the ball rolling because of the timing that we really need to get going on this.
So a timing question then, perfect segue. I noticed there's only one date in the due date column.
Well, we have others, but so, you know, this one there, and we're still filling it out. For the most part, I feel like a lot of the dates for the intermediary steps are stretchy, but we're still trying to get at least dates pulled into these larger bolded parts. But like everything here, it's a work in progress to try to build those out. To this end, I'd actually like to bump this up earlier so that we can really move this due date down to the analysis part. Basically, I want to be downloading data and starting to compile the database before our next working group meeting in February so that we can move forward. And that's pushing things a little bit, but it'd be great to be able to start going that way. Doesn't mean we have to make any firm decisions on what's in and what's out, but it's a start. Any other questions or thoughts on this?
So I'll just note that. Oh, go ahead. I heard someone.
No, Rosa, it's Chris. I was going to maybe go where you were going, so why don't you go ahead?
Oh, no, I was just going to note that this is, as Alex mentioned, a work in progress. It's really the state staff team supporting this group was trying to think, well, we need to organize ourselves to support this group and help you all with your decision making. So I will share this with you so you can see our thinking, because we really want your input on, are we supporting you enough? Is this the right way to approach it? So Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think maybe a little beyond that, I know we're going to talk about kind of, the next, what the next kind of bunch of meetings look like for the working group, and maybe even bring up, the potential for kind of having kind of one-off discussions on specific topics. So kind of given that we're kind of almost into February and we had identified, wanting to get to a place where we have kind of, the draft criteria, pulled together by the end of March, we're going to try to think about how we can kind of accelerate some of the conversations here, just kind of, acknowledging everybody is super busy and, has day jobs in addition to this. So, I guess I would say for all the working group members, just be vocal about kind of what's realistic, and let's kind of really make sure we're thinking about the timelines here. And then if we could start to identify due dates or kind of like for these tasks and key milestones, when we actually have to have something, finished, that gives us an opportunity to then kind of work back from there. So, yeah, there's obviously a lot to do, but we want to figure out how we could help kind of move the needle on the work, so we can get to a point in March where we're feeling good about at least an initial draft set of criteria.
This is Jared from ANCA. Chris, I just want to say appreciate you kind of bringing that up and acknowledging that we're all busy and there's a lot going on in this document. And Rose, I appreciate the fact that you'll send this out. I think that'll be helpful for all the members. But how do we reconcile the fact that once you send this out, it'll be kind of stagnant compared to what Alex is doing, developing this kind of day in and day out? Like, how do we make sure that the version we're looking at is the most up to date and not wasting time, evaluating some of these tasks or the critical path components of this, just to come back to a working group meeting and then you kind of start at square one?
I don't know if Alex was going to jump in, but the version that I'll share is the living document. So we can make it so that Alex can update it and you can see if she has updated it at all. But what we really wanted was for you to take a look at it and make the changes that we're not seeing, right? Because we were trying to be realistic and wanted to be mindful of your efforts and your time. But of course, we might be stretching it. We might be asking too much, or we might be pushing the timetable too quickly, right? So we really wanted to make sure you took a look at this and gave us your feedback before we moved anywhere else, right?
Okay, yeah, thank you for clarifying that, and having access to the the living document will certainly help. But as people kind of intersect with this at different points along the way and different times, I'm trying to kind of work through how we can make sure that the work that one person does isn't negated by work that somebody else does, at a later point.
I think, Rosa, we can chat through kind of a system to do that, but if anyone's making major revisions or things like that, to sending out a note to the working group so that they're aware of it will be a helpful way of dealing with some of the version control issues. And then I would really love to see, where the holes are, what you're thinking, where you think we're missing, critical components. And then, we can get together and talk through it. This can be one of those, webinar type discussions that we can have, is to go through the missing components. The idea here is really, I think we can manage the version control and just, I think in some ways over communicate on it to help make that happen. And then generally, I think we know it's going to change, but this is at least a map out, trying to show the complexity of it, of how things are running, and trying to get it all done by the end of March is a big task. So I wanted to show you all what I think it entails at the very minimum, and what we think then, and how all of us interplay together to make it happen, and where those are critical points. So I would love to, I know you haven't seen this before. This was kind of my addition, especially in the with the eye of we want to be as transparent as possible what the process is and trying to show you what our process is. I think I found with the interviews that we did have that this was helpful, being as transparent as possible about what we're thinking. So in that spirit, we're just going to open it all wide up and show all the messiness of research, because we should always show the messiness of research.
Thanks, Alex. And Eddie, did you have a question? I noticed you in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Rosa, and thanks, Alex, for this. I know it's this thing's a bit of a beast, and you know, this spreadsheet makes the plot line for Tenet understandable. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's just, but here's what I'd love to. Part of my problem, in addition to not having found time to sit down with y'all, so Rosa, thank you for it. We'll find time soon. I desperately hope. But part of my problem is not. I would really love, and I think the rest of us would really love to have a real world practical sense of the application of rubrics and indicators in real world setting, which we have in California. We've been asking repeatedly. Folks, I think we've gotten to the point where, like, for me to be able to make cogent recommendations, I need to know how it's worked in California. Like, I need to know how, you know, both from the government side and the advocate side, what's worked, what's not worked. There are lessons learned from Cali that would maybe make our lives hopefully easier, or maybe harder, Alex, I don't know. But is there any opportunity for us to be able to relatively soon have that presentation from California so that we're at least better informed about some of the missteps that they may have made in attempting this kind of system?
Yes, we are actively engaging to get that on the books. And for me, the goal would be to have that at, one of our February sessions. So if, and I think almost all of you have filled out the scheduling poll, so we're very close on the dates for February and March, so that'll be great. So thank you, Eddie, for the reminder. But yes, it would be great for this group to hear more about lessons learned and what's worked and what hasn't worked over there. Because I know our Loom team has done a lot of research into it, but it's always great to hear it from the mouths of the people who are living through it, right?
And these are the public webinars, right? Like, it's not going to be just for us. The way this group's meetings are open and public, I assume the webinars will be as well, correct?
It can be. If that's the desire, we can make it open to the public. Yep. And then, it's not a real world application, but I know that Alex planned to go through the rubric today and really show you her experience of using that tool to evaluate the list of indicators and hear from you if her process makes sense, if there's any place where we should be changing the way we're using that application. So I'll let Alex take over for that.
Yeah. And Eddie, to your point about California, I think it's really important. Rosa's been trying to herd goats. What is it? Herd? I don't know the American
cats.
English. Thank you. I miss some of those sometimes. But it is, you're right. It's going to be really, really helpful. I can say that in reading a lot of the papers from California and seeing in the approach and what Amanda has presented before about the approach, one of the things I want to avoid in this work with you is to come up with one definition and then have to overlay a bunch of other things. Right. So to me, that's where the system fell down, and they might find that that's working really well for California. So it's a good question to ask them. But that's where I think things fell down because, in my view, they were trying to do things too cleanly, and so I actually really want us to lean into
California usually does, don't they? New York is the messy one. Sorry,
that's not good.
My last coastal dive. I'll stop.
Well, let's lead into the messy in this case, because I think it's like that's where we got to go, and to that point, like let's do that now, and that's why I actually wanted to show the Excel sheet with the so I showed this last time. We had the rubric here just to refresh your memory, I'm going to go through that, but then I'm going to go through what we did with each of the indicators and then talk through kind of, okay, where are the gaps? Because to me, that's the most important part. Like, where are the gaps? What are we missing? What did this give us? And then start thinking about how we can plug those holes, either analytically or by finding data, that kind of stuff. So, are we good to go? Can everyone see this? Because, you know, little screens and all that kind of stuff. Do you need me to make it bigger? Thumbs up from Rosa. Okay. So I shared this last time, but again, to refresh your memory, the idea here is that we have some information about all the indicators, some better information than others. And I would like to say, you know, we're still interviewing and talking with different groups to get more up-to-date knowledge about what these indicators can be and which ones are good, which ones people have good, readily available data, and which ones don't, that kind of stuff. So to that end, I'm going to show you, you know, we have these sections, these 4 sections. We've got the applicability to the CLCPA disadvantaged communities language, and those are based on which pillar they really adhere to. Some of them adhere to a couple, so we try to do that. Generally, in the scoring system we have, higher scores mean better values, adhering to things better. You know, so what we tried to do, and again, I'm not striving for perfection here. Like, what I want this to be, this rubric to be, is like a way for us to cut off at least half, or maybe not quite half, but at least like narrow down the indicators so that we can start downloading the data that do pass muster and then go through them. So in this case, Pillar 1, does it represent pollutions or hazards that lead to negative public health effects? Does it capture the cumulative legacy of environmental pollution or hazards? Does it, for Pillar 2, represent people or communities who have historically experienced disparities in clean energy and energy efficiency investments or services? Does it represent people or communities who have historically experienced discrimination in the areas of housing, workforce development, pollution reduction, low income, energy assistance, energy, transportation, or economic development? And I will tell you that this pillar, I think, is by far and away the toughest to try to gauge and get information on. So it's something I want to talk to you all about. Pillar 3 is the climate change pillar, which is, does it reflect environmental or climate conditions or events that may be exacerbated by climate change? Does it capture population or community characteristics that exacerbate risks of climate change? Any questions about that? I know we've gone through the rubric. I just want to make sure that you all are feeling acquainted with it, feeling comfortable with it. Okay, we talked about this one last time. This is to me, the murkiest one, which is the actionable or addressable by the CLCPA investments. And so here we're trying to answer the question of, does this indicator kind of represent exposure, risks, or threats, or vulnerabilities that are potentially actionable by New York State agencies? And then the second one, represent exposures, risks, threats, or vulnerabilities that could be addressed by clean energy or energy efficiency investments. There's a nuance there. This section in particular, I'm not striving for perfection for. I just want us to get a sense of, is this something that's realistically can be addressed or not? Was there, I saw something fleeting in blue as far as a comment. Rosa, was there anything?
Yes, Eddie is saying that acquaintance, yes, but comfortable is a little bit of a stretch.
I can get
Sorry, that was meant to be a joke, Alex. I didn't know you saw it. I didn't mean to distract you. Please keep going. I'm so sorry. Keep going.
Well, it is kind of fun. You know, it's totally on point. I'm not sure I'm fully comfortable with this, but it does give us a rough sense of things. And that actually, what made me feel good about this was when I read these individually, I'm like, I don't know about that. But when we started scoring these, then I thought, okay, again, as a rough thing for us to try to gauge, I feel better about it. Now, C and D are the ones that actually are, to me, from a data analysis point, really very critical. And in this case, these are the ones where we kind of need to understand the value or the the value the indicator can bring to the larger model that we create. And so in this case, we've got, is the indicator a direct or indirect measure of the concept? And last time I talked about, the hazard index, the respiratory hazard index, as opposed to the ED visits, which for asthma, are less of a direct measure than the respiratory hazard index. For the most part, we're going to want direct measures for the actual definition, though I think the indirect measures will be a very good way of gauging programmatic success or different intervention success later on. Is the core variable mentioned in the legislation? This one is for us to make sure, frankly, that we make sure that every single one that is mentioned in the legislation is included in the model, even if it fails the rest of the rubric. It needs to be in there at least in some way. This second one, this third one really here, and this one is it essential or unique? And honestly, this one's kind of a tricky one because what we want is to have indicators that provide sufficient, like informative, good things to the model. We don't want them all to be like totally separate because the concepts, you could just be missing an aspect of a concept. Let's take migration, climate migration, or migration overall. That concept is actually a pretty complex one. So trying to make sure that we can get it from multiple angles with different indicators. We want them to overlap a little bit. But we don't want them to like fully subsume one another because then, that's just adding an indicator for no reason. So in this case, like striving for 2 or 3, I think is useful. We don't want everything to overlap. We don't want everything to be, totally separate. But this one is one for me analytically that I'm kind of taking a look at and thinking about what to do for the different concepts. And then finally, the last part of the rubric is the sufficient data quality. Is it available at the geographic level that we need? And in this case, we're looking at census tracts. I think that's right. And I want us to be able to download the data at the level that we need so that we can not have to do as much manipulation of the data as possible to get those data. Some of them will have to do some shifts to do, but that's okay. Hence why this is a rubric and not just a one-all be-all. Is it considered accurate with limited measurement error? This one's really important, actually. We want things that are consistent across the regions that we want to use that indicator for. And what that means to me is say for the asthma ED visit data, if that is supplied by different doctors' coding of data, of say doctor visits, and they code it as an asthma visit as opposed to something else, that is then upon that doctor to make that code. And lots of people, lots of doctors code things differently depending on insurance and everything else. So there's going to be a lot of variability in this data that will be less so in the respiratory hazard index, where those are more measurements based on, different apparatus that are out there. I still think this one's funny. Is it current or up to date? Evidently up to date, we're feeling okay with things that are 2014. And that's kind of sad, but that's where we're at. We want to look at the data and think through the up-to-dateness of it because some things age and we want to be critically thinking about those things, especially, again, as an evaluative thing later. We want the most up-to-date data we can, but we'll also accept things that are slightly older if we need to. And then can we get it in the timeline that we need? This is like the most rudimentary thing. We got to get the data. Let's get it, see if we can get it right away so that we can start analyzing it. Any questions on the rubric before I move on and show you the things that we found?
One small question, and I apologize if this is a dumb question. Is there a row down there where these numbers are already tallied up? Like,
yes.
Where's that row?
Wait, you mean, oh, well, so I made it readable here. So I didn't tally the numbers for this example, but what I did do was, bear with me, we took every single indicator and we now transpose the data. So we like flipped it, right? So you're seeing one indicator for one row here. And then we went through and did this for each one. So you've got the pillar rankings, and then, does it represent the exposures? Is it a direct indicator? All those. And then we mapped all those. And then we got the rubrics A, B, and C and D scores here. For clarity's sake, for a couple of the rubric examples, we have 1s and 0s. Everything else is on a 1 to 3 scale. So if it's a 1 here, we multiplied it by 3 so that it would get to the same level, because those are really important ones. And then we added it all up. So we've got the sub, rubric scales, and then we've got the overall score. And the green highlight are those that are above average as opposed to below average. And then these flags were really us saying, okay, is it above average? And then this one is it above average and mentioned in the legislation?
Thank you, Alex. And again, apologize if I missed anything. We haven't seen this version yet, right?
We sent it out. So Rosa sent it out in an Excel doohickey. So you should have everything except for I made a couple little, I updated it a little bit as far as what I want us to talk about today. But otherwise, the same data are here. I should note, in some ways, these are slightly outdated because as we go and start meeting with different, groups, like we're doing this almost on a daily basis, some of these scores change. But again, they're not wholesale large things. It's just more of like, use this one instead of this one. So they may all pass, but we're going to, go through it that way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is all crazy and intimidating, right? It's like an obscenely large amount of indicators. 153 that we have in here, and I think it kind of varies by day, whether we add another one or not. What I wanted to do was, rather than us like spending time going through this crazy thing, was really think through, okay, the gaps in the concepts of things. So what I did was a fancy little pivot table, just saying like, okay, well, what was above average and what isn't above average? Because, those below average, if we're trying to whittle things down, that were able to be scored. So 134 indicators that we could score. Let's just look at the chunk. If it's, where are we missing things? Where are we not missing things? So 77 of those 134 were above average scores. And then what I wanted to know was, okay, for the pillars, where are we missing things? Where are we not? So clearly, environmental pollution and hazards is doing just fine. And in fact, we're going to want to whittle some of these down and make some choices of things to exclude in our analysis, because we don't need 11 air quality indicators. We'll just talk to the experts and ask them which ones they want or think are the best, and then we'll use those. We'll include a few, but not 11. But there are parts where we're missing stuff. So I'm actually really happy that we got 22 indicators that pass muster for the people and historical discrimination pillar. But there are some parts, critically the historical discrimination part, that we don't have something for. And then in my mind, I go to, is this something we can address analytically? Like, are there ways that we can look at income and race and ethnicity, and then apply that, say, looking at past shifts, et cetera, like that, with data to get at historical discrimination, rather than trying to create an indicator in of itself that addresses this directly. Any questions or thoughts on this?
Hey, Alex, this is Neil from
Hey,
DOH.
Neil.
And I just also wanted to reiterate that the appreciation I have for the amount of work that you guys put into this. And I guess my one thought in looking at that first spreadsheet that Rosa sent, and then this, is that even just taking the above average 57 indicators is still a lot. And I'm just worried that when you get to the, I think data reduction is a really good approach. And I'm worried a little bit when we get to the factor analysis, the interpretability of that. I mean, I know that you're probably well aware, it can be difficult to kind of communicate what that actually means. And so I'm just wondering, if you also have alternative approaches on the table, and if, I recall that Cal and ViroScreen took maybe a more straightforward approach that I think is, very easy to interpret. I'm not saying we want to necessarily take that approach, but just throwing that out there as a thought that, we'll probably need to revisit at some point.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to. Honestly, I see this as like a funnel approach where we do some of the data reduction because I want to be true to the data on some level. And also I want to kind of apply some of that messy thinking in addition to, okay, yeah, we've got one indicator for this, and let's just go that way, which is more the California approach of things. And also, I think one of the things that to be clear, when you get to, is it available at the geographic level that we want? That's when things really start to fall out. And so, it does help clarify and simplify some of the things that we will do. And so I would like to reduce things down so that they're a simpler part before we get into the data reduction. But I also don't want to limit us to just one method right now. Mostly because I think if we're making a lot of choices without really seeing what the distributions look like, without really seeing what how the data work together and interact, which I think is frankly going to be an interesting place to look at, we may not realize that some of those correlations are going to be especially fruitful for us to model something. And in my opinion, that's the part where I want to take, well, this is entirely, and to be honest with you, my own bias of taking a less of a econometric kind of approach to things, more rigidly, like saying what it is, and take more of a psychological approach to things and seeing like where the data lie. But that's, of course, because that's my background, so I'm going to be influenced to that. But we do have Amanda, who's an economist, kind of pulling in that direction. So both of us provide a really good balance to one another. I hear you, Neil.
So we'll have it at some point between you and Amanda, right?
Oh yeah, it's always good. We get way better things because we talk through them that way. It's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah.
But this is why this is an ongoing conversation and something that we really critically need to think through. And I do want to call out, like, so on the face of it, it looks great. We've got 77. We only have a few places where we're missing some things, and we can, population health, I think we can get something there. Exacerbated health risk, I think that none of them passed. We can look and see what we can address and find in there if we want to. Analytically, I think we can get at migration by including other elements to see if we can get at that concept. But when we start really seeing, okay, now we're missing at the geographic level that we need economic risks, exacerbated health risks, housing quality, migration, vulnerability, and then we've got historical discrimination, health effects of air pollution. I think this is why having environmental justice perspective on this is so critical, right? Because the things that are directly related to environmental justice are the things that are missing. So we got to fix that on a system-wide way, but we also need to start thinking through how can we make sure that these concepts are at least included in our thinking throughout this process. So the imperfect solution I have is to take these 43 and start whittling down those that are 5 and bring them, or above, and bringing them down to like 2 or 3 before we go forward. And Neil, this is where, you know, we're talking to the people like you and others who have a lot of experience in different areas and saying like, well, use this one. And once we narrow those down, that will be very useful. But we also need to start thinking about how we can fill these gaps. And that's where I'd like to open it up and have a discussion with you all about how we fill those gaps, because these are pretty critical. And we may be able to fill them analytically speaking with other different indicators in here, but I'm seeing a lot of things that are missing, and I don't like that. I'm not just pausing for dramatic effect. I do want to get your thoughts on this, and so I do want to open it up a little bit and just have us look at each other, think of this. If there's anything that you guys have off the cuff of your mind of places to look, we can dig into these and look at economic risks and look at the indicators and talk through those specifically. But again, this is why today is going to be a messy day. I want us to really think critically about these.
Alex, this is Jared from ACA again. So kind of getting back to this version control topic, at what point, I guess, are the members of this group going to be cut off from providing any kind of feedback or comment on the indicators? Or is there an established time for that? Because, like, for example, next week I'm going to take this spreadsheet to my other program directors at our organization who deal with local food systems, diversity, equity, inclusion, entrepreneurship in the North Country, and try to get them to weigh in on all these indicators. And as we discussed in our one-on-one conversation, nobody's an expert on 150 different indicators. So
yep.
What I'm hoping to get out of this meeting is feedback and comments from them on the version that I download, right before that meeting. But how do I take that comment and feedback from my organization and put it back into the version that is live? Like, do I send it directly to you and then you can report it in?
Yeah.
Or because I don't really have the time to take all those comments and move it over to this version.
And you don't have to. That's totally on us. So I don't want concern about version control to stop any of you from giving the thoughts and ideas of it that you need. So I'd rather us make sure that we take the data that you have, the information that you have. And I'm going to be kind of, I don't know, it's almost scary to say, but I would rather you all, as we're building this thing, as we're running with it, that if you have more information or more data and it's even later in the game and we've decided to kind of roll without an indicator, but you find another one, well, then we can add it back in. There might be a stopping point once we've, really started narrowing things down and creating scenarios. But while we're creating the database, which we still, haven't done, we're just starting to download the most obvious things like income, that you can still give us information and feedback and thoughts.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Eddie, and then after Eddie, Sonal.
Thanks again so much, Alex and the Illume team. This is, as I said in the chat, this is pretty amazing how far you brought us from the early deliberations to this. What would be helpful, I don't know how many people have yet to have their one-on-ones with you, Alex. What would be helpful for me and hopefully useful for you is if we can have, if there are a series of prompt questions before we sit down with you so we can make the most effective use of our one-on-one. That would be, I guess, for at least for me, and I don't know who else hasn't met with you, maybe the optimal way of having our one-on-one, unless something like that was shared and it's lost in the inbox somewhere.
Yeah, no, it hasn't been, and we can come up with those. We have I've let each of those one-on-ones be guided by the person who I've been talking to, who Rosa and I have been talking to. We've shared it basically to this level, although we've dug a little deeper as far as the analysis, and then kind of answered questions of how different people were to understand our process and what we were thinking as far as data reduction and things like that. But every single person has gone a different direction. And that's actually exactly what we wanted. We wanted to hear what your concerns were, what your thoughts were, and then have you ask us questions about what's your process, what are you thinking of this, what are you doing to that. So Eddie, I'll come up with a couple questions for prompts and thinking. What I ask each of you to do is to bring your expertise to the indicators and pillars and approach that you have, and to give me those opinions and those thoughts, and guide us, because we're trying to hold all these 77, 43, or 134 indicators in our hands, and we're not experts in all of those things, and so it's really vital that we hear from you all about what you think is most vital. And to that point, earlier you talked about the manufacturing sites and brown sites, and I think that those are elements that we're trying to build in and bring in as they become available.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Sonal, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks for everything with this, Alex. You're talking about how some of these can be applied in the analytical stage. Just to clarify, are you referring to like proxy, or is that something that would be helpful to think through now? Like I would think something such as vulnerability to outages and climate events, like in areas we work in. I might think about medical device dependency and things like that, for example, which isn't like this obviously this exact indicator, but could start pointing to that. So I'm wondering if that's kind of the suggestion that's helpful at this point.
I think it is. And I think that trying to think through those, what I was thinking analytically, I'll talk to you about kind of when you talk about data reduction techniques or factor analysis, is the idea that you've got two different indicators or two different variables that then bump up to this larger concept. And so what we're talking about with each of these are concepts that actually could have a couple indicators that flesh out that concept. So we might want to keep two of them, at least in our initial assessment of the indicators. So all those things build. But I also think that again, you're actually right. Medical baseline for the rate base within energy from the utility might be a really great thing if we could get those data. Probably can't get them by the time we have, but if there's a way that we can build that in, then that could give us indirectly some different elements. I think one of the things that we realized is that it's very hard, and particularly, Eddie, we've spoken to 5 of the working group members, but one of the things that throughout those conversations is that the larger indicator list is overwhelming and a little bit crazy. But if you start thinking about these concepts and then you start thinking about where the gaps are, that's when you can start going like, oh, okay, well, what was that economic risk indicator? Why didn't it pass? Or why didn't it passed, because these are all the above average scores, but then why doesn't it have the geographic level? And then we can dig in there. And so those are the ways that we can whittle down and then finally get our brains to be like, okay, and not overwhelmed, and start talking about it. I'm gonna pause. Rosa, is there anything from the chat?
Looks like Abigail has a question.
If everyone else has had a chance to weigh in, because I know I've been talking too much today.
I don't see any other hands, Abigail, so feel free.
So I would highly recommend the one-on-one meeting. I found it very helpful, and I appreciate you guys are doing that. And one thing that really bubbled up for me coming out of that is that to the extent that these indicators can identify not just the presence of risk factors, but the community's ability to respond to those risk factors. I think that intersection, I'm not sure, and I'd love to hear you talk more about how do we capture that? And then I have a follow-up question, but I'll leave that one.
Yeah, that's such a tricky one, and I think we can draw in several people to think through that. But like one of the things I've been thinking of is how to do this and find a designation for disadvantaged communities that feel right, and then feel right to that. So that's kind of like a separate, very academic kind of perspective of things. And then what you're talking about, Abigail, correct me if I'm wrong here, is to think like, well, how can actual communities address the things that we're talking about? Is that?
Well, no, I mean, I'm talking about, so if, one of these big areas is environmental pollution and concerns, that to me does not define a community necessarily. I mean, yes, there's definitely correlation there, right? But well, I think, well, let me give a concrete example, because this is the one that we had discussed in our meeting. The algal blooms, right? And that Canandaigua Lake has algal blooms, also has like the highest property values outside of Lake Tahoe. Clearly not a disadvantaged community. And I know there's, you also mentioned there's never going to be just one indicator that defines what a disadvantaged community is. But so the presence of the risk factor to me is like subjugated, I guess, to the community's ability to respond to that.
Okay, I'm gonna. Oh, Amanda's jump in, my dear.
I think this really hits on what California struggled with in the framework they set up for distinguishing between risks and burdens and vulnerabilities. And they decided to take that multiplicative approach so they could have both. So they consider that some things are kind of standing risks and threats, and some are vulnerabilities, as you said, that affect communities' abilities to respond. I don't know if that's helpful, but I definitely see the tension in that we have things on both sides of things.
I'm going to ask that whatever you just said, Amanda, be very well captured in the notes, because my children are yelling at me. I totally didn't get it, but I'm sure it was a great answer.
Let's say it again. And I totally get the children yelling, by the way, right there with
I think this hits on the way that California set things up, recognizing that they wanted to capture both risks and threats, as well as vulnerabilities. So risks and threats meaning like factors communities face, as well as communities' ability to adapt and face them. And that's why they kind of put those in those two broad categories. They had categories within, and they ended up multiplying things to say, okay, the risk, you're going to score highest if you have that threat and you also have a vulnerability to that threat. So I don't know if that answers it, but we definitely have things in both buckets here. And like, I think part of the methodology is figuring out like, well, do we want to be additive and just allow things to be added, or do we want some kind of approach that acknowledges we have things on both sides of that equation?
Thank you. That does really help. The other thing that I just, oh gosh, somebody else should take over.
All right. Rava also is next, and then Amy.
Oh, Abigail, I so empathize with you right now. It's like how my days always go. So yeah, I think I am really appreciating this conversation. And in my check-in with Alex, I also felt somewhat overwhelmed by what the Climate Justice Working Group was supposed to do and what we were kind of charged with, listening to all of the other working groups, and it has to all be filtered through the CAC. And I think, and also we are addressing, I think the point that Abigail and others have raised many times is, New York State is not monolithic. And so, one of the ways that I could see our work over time is to do the best that we can with all of the information that we have, but that, you know, whether it's using the regional districts or what have you, the 10 districts, and embedding kind of a climate justice working group. And as over time, as whatever these strategies are going to be implemented, that in real time, regions will be able to answer the questions of, are the intentions of the climate justice working group and what a disadvantaged community is being implemented in a way that is actually working in our community? And as we're as like the, you know, year 4, year 5, year 10, whatever, as we continue to iterate and evolve, then I think the that strategy will produce the best outcomes. Because again, you know, I always say this, I love my brother Eddie over downstate and Sonoma and all of y'all, but Buffalo, New York is more of a Midwestern state than it is an East Coast state, like honestly, right? And so the implementation and these strategies, and Rochester too, that's right, are gonna just look very, very different. The underlying issues, you know, like the criteria and what have you, can all be the same, but then how the intervention is implemented is really going to matter if we're actually going to make the kind of, you know, if our intentions for why the disadvantaged communities and why those investments need to happen in those communities is going to be implemented in a way that actually makes a difference long term.
Yeah, I think it's just so important to acknowledge both of what both of you said, and to think about, and I think it's really useful to kind of have Amanda's knowledge and thoughts about how California is using this approach where they're having both and then multiplying it across. I want to try that out with the indicators we have and creating that system. I also want to try out a system where it's either weighted or shifted in a different way, which, you know, there's so many different ways of dealing with this that we can do that. We can test out those different versions. And so part of the thing that, as we start cracking this nut and downloading the data and starting to look at it, we need to then look at those different recipes and build them out and see. And this is where that validity check comes in for each of you with your known communities that we're relying upon to be like, oh, well, this one works for here, this one doesn't work there, but it works here, here, and here. And then we have to figure out which one is the most applicable for the most people in the area. And so I don't want us to stick to, here's the one approach we're going to use and we're going to mirror California's, or we're going to go with my wholehearted, let's just be messy with it approach. But like, let's try them all, owning that it's going to be hard, but I think really vital to do. I think that's the critical element here that we have to embrace. So keep asking the questions and keep pulling us and reminding us that, you know, there are certain places that are going to have some of these big things, but they are not disadvantaged communities. And that's the test that you have to bring when we give you those maps, when we give you the designations. Be like, okay, we'll go search for those. Have those in the back of your mind. You know they're going to score high on this one thing, but you don't think they're a disadvantaged community. Do that proof test. And so that's why I want to keep this as kind of open-ended as possible at this point, so that we can download the data we can. We don't have to have every single one of these concepts represented. That's not what we're after. But what I want to do is make sure that some of the larger concepts within this idea of climate change and disadvantaged communities and environmental justice, that we're getting enough of these concepts to get a good viable measure of that pillar. That to me matters, less the specifics down here.
So we have Amy, did you have a question? And then after Amy, Sono.
No, I just, as Amanda was talking, it just occurred to me that, you know, when she was talking about sort of different communities and what different communities have to offer, it sounded like almost a SWOT analysis, you know, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities. And, you know, I think that also aligns with what Ramo was talking about, and how communities are so different, you know, Buffalo versus New York City, upstate versus downstate, And, you know, our communities, while they might have similar threats, they also have different opportunities or different strengths that they could bring to the table. And so I guess I'm also not sure how to capture that and nuance that.
I love the idea of a SWOT analysis once we get there. I think that that's an awesome idea. I think there's a lot of discussion as far as, to your point about geography and the differences between the large diversity of communities in New York State, and how to capture that is trying to think of models that are not monolithic to New York State. Thou shall have one way of defining things, but to see like, well, is there urban, rural, suburban split thing? Is there an upstate, downstate thing? Like, is the recipe slightly different? We're still baking biscuits, but we're making them whole wheat over here, and I don't know. These metaphors just keep flying away with me, but the idea here is that if we have to test each of those, and so that's the part where I think keep bringing this up, because this is where the vital thinking is, less so on which individual metric. You know, that's my job. And Amanda's job to be like, okay, well, we're going to use X, Y, and Z, and that's why we've interviewed 5 people about air quality, and these are the 2 things that we're going to use. We want to hear your input on that. We start doing that, but it's the larger calculation and modeling. That's where the brain craziness is going to come in. That's when that really critical thinking and sense making is gonna be really vital.
All right, Sonal, you're up.
Yeah, one kind of like specific thing I'm thinking about with like housing quality as an area that needs to be filled in, and this kind of overlaps with, this completely overlaps with energy program, which doesn't need as much work, but I didn't see it on the indicator list, and maybe I'm just missing it, but energy use intensity. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that idea, which is kind of a proxy for energy waste and points to energy inefficient housing. And so that might be helpful in pointing to some housing quality indicators. I'm really not sure how available that data is. Maybe someone else that knows this term can speak to it better. But I understand, Dr. Tony Reeves from Michigan has done a lot of work on describing how that is really related to housing quality. So just a specific suggestion there.
Yeah, that's a good one. I also think high energy burden could inform some of that too. I also, I'm not averse to looking at, okay, we have a housing quality indicator that passed the geographic, like it passed the above average rubric thing, but it just isn't at the census tract level. Well, what can we do? Can we like transform it in such a way? So it might not be as granularly perfect, but it might be enough to get us there. But I do think it's also important to know that, what I want is a robust measure of Pillar 3, not all of these per se, but what I want is that robust measure of Pillar 3. That said, what makes me most worried is that in Pillar 3, there are more red. There's more red, and then there are just fewer overall to work with. There's 8 indicators as opposed to 20 here and 13 here, and so it's just mostly us calling in and thinking about exactly what you said, Sonal. Like, is there another thing? And I want us to look at those and think through them.
So we have scheduled for a 10-minute break during, these discussions. I think now would be a good time to take those 10 minutes, and, while you're going to the bathroom or getting something to eat, if you come up with any other questions, we'll reconvene at 3:22, and we'll have about 40 minutes left for this conversation. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you're all coming back from our 10-minute break. Great, we've got our Excel sheet back up.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so Alex, where do you think we turn from here? Are you still looking for feedback on some of these gaps that are highlighted?
I do. I wanted to show kind of, I pulled the indicators that do pass for pillar 3. They're just below in the Excel sheet, so you can see kind of what's there. And what I'd like is for kind of looking at that climate change pillar, looking at what we do have, you know, is that enough? Is that enough to get going? In my view, I think it's almost there, but there's like one thing maybe that we can pull in is something related more to health rather than just health access to those with health insurance. So yeah, I'd love to kind of talk through this, but then also I think on a larger scale, I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to, you know, talk on the fly on these and think on the fly, but just invite comment and thoughts on this after the fact, after you've reviewed this. If you can take the time, that would be great. Any thoughts on what I'm showing here as far as here are the ones that passed and that we have data for at available kind of spot. High energy burden, I think is going to be a great one. Resilience, urban heat island, water level, those are all good. Access, we have some good ones. The economic risk, I think, I'm not sure that there is something that has been created, and I think we can analytically get at that. The exacerbated health risk, though, is the one that I'm kind of curious about if anyone has any thoughts. And then anything on housing quality, again, trying to figure, maybe we can use housing burden and a combination of renting owner to try to get at that.
All right, from the chat, I see Eddie.
Hi, others on this call sure can talk about the exacerbated health risk and high energy burden. Regarding economic risk, if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of different studies that talk about the disproportionate, the economic risk in terms of failure to properly account for sea level rise as part of the storm surge projections. So there are insurance economic risks, and there are a few others that's just out there. So I don't know if folks were thinking of that, but that's something that's measurable, and there are all sorts of economic risks of climate change studies that are out there that we could somehow figure out a way to factor in here.
Yeah, we can take a look at that. I think that would be a great one. Anybody else?
Alex, this is Neil. In terms of vulnerability to outages and climate, I'm not sure if this would be helpful, but I know previously we had done some work looking at health effects during power outages, and I think NIPA had data on, they had pretty good data sets on where power outages were occurring, and I'm just wondering if there might be a way to summarize that somehow into an indicator of, where power outages may be more common, for whatever reason.
And was that just for LIPA territory, Long Island?
It was actually NIPA.
NIPA.
I think is where, or maybe it was a PSC. Actually, I think it was PSC, Public Service Commission.
Okay. ESC.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll take a look at that because I had thought about power outages, having kind of done a lot of work in Long Island and thinking actually that would be a critical thing to start looking at and thinking through. So that would be a very good one.
Right, and Jared is pointing out in the chat that the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel, we could probably tap into them for high energy burden and housing quality. And then Abigail is up next with a question.
So I have a question following up on the EUI data, and then also related the energy burden. So start with the energy burden one. To what extent is there available data not at the geographic level on that, but at the household level?
Ooh, you know, let's go look at it. Energy burden.
And Chris, I mean, I don't know, Chris, do you know the answer to that, like off the top of your head? Not to put you on the spot. Chris, are you there? Has a little like hazard mark next to his name.
Oh, no.
Okay, well, forget that then.
Well, I do want to say, like, so we've got the indicator here is the like DOE lead tool. So it's average energy cost as percentage of income, and I believe that that would be a census pulled up to census tract level, so not housing level. I will say this: California was working on a lot of energy burden kind of metrics and things like that. They have some, but it's almost all survey related and therefore not consistent data that you can get on a household level.
So my other question was related with EUI, and is Chris back? Because I think maybe not. I'm just wondering, with both of these, to what extent does the utility have this data, or could the data? I know there's all kinds of like privacy, this and that and the other thing concerns, but like that seems like super relevant data that if the utility has it.
They won't have high energy burden, but they would have low income rate by household. So if they're on the low income rate, each utility has that because they offer a low income rate. And so they flag that really well. But to do high energy burden, you need energy costs to income, and they don't have the income side of things on that.
And there's not like a simple way of just kind of like, no.
I wish.
And
No.
so I guess then on the EUI would be the same, like square footage.
So I've seen, this is actually funny. Like, so O-Power is, you know, the rate, like they compare you to other kind of similar neighbors, and they give you you're doing really well and you're nice and you're horrible, frowny face, like, and social comparisons. You get a couple percentage of energy savings from that. They use tax assessor data, I think, to get the size of the home and then do it. It is a huge undertaking to do it. And so we won't have that, we couldn't get that in time. And it's a very complex thing. But that said, it's not something that, it is something that you could build, but you'd have to update it regularly and, you know, do that. That's not to say it's not a very interesting thing to try to get.
Yeah, and the idea of, you know, just thinking about the granularity we need, I'm just thinking about this EUI issue, you know, very hard to calculate accurately on a household basis because you need for each household an accurate square footage and accurate energy use variable, but there might be some things we could think about whether it would be easier or more valid to calculate at the census tract level and aggregate. So for example, if there's a way to look at the sum of all energy usage for residential accounts at the census tract, and the denominator being the sum of all, you know, residential building square footage. I mean, still really messy, a lot of error, but we can continue thinking about whether there's anything we could do to calculate an aggregate rate, where the aggregate might smooth out a lot of the inaccuracies you would get if you really tried to predict for each household.
Yeah, I like that approach. That's similar to a housing, or sorry, high energy burden idea for housing quality approach.
Can I just push a little further on this? Sorry. So the utility, like what utility data, what can the utility provide, broadly speaking?
Okay, so I'm going to speak not from a New York utility perspective, but from the lots of experience of what you can get from utilities. And what would be, I think, useful in this case would be average bill. You could get kilowatt hours used or gas therms used per month kind of thing. You know, all of those different elements. You could get the rate that they're on, so low income versus not versus medical baseline, often those different flags. And then you'd have to aggregate that, because there's no way that they'll give you household level data on that, but they could consider, you know, pulling that up to something like a zip code level. They don't have tracked data in there, so it's not like a census level thing. But I will say this, having worked as an evaluator in other states, we're trying to aggregate statewide, so across multiple utilities, because that's what New York has many, or at least several very big ones and other small ones, is that it is really challenging to get good data consistently that can aggregate across the whole state.
I have to push on this a little further, because, you know, the PSC supposedly regulates these utilities, and this is like, is there a way to streamline the process? And I know that's not a question you can answer, so that is a rhetorical question.
But it is a good question. It's good data. I mean, it is good data, and it could be very useful. So it's something that if you can push on with your ability to push on it, every evaluator would be happy to get those data, right? Every person who's trying to build this type of thing would be happy. But on the reality side of my experience of things, it's just very, very hard to get those data on a regular basis. It's not to say it's not impossible. And if you can do it, do it.
Hey, go climate activists.
Yeah, it's good data to have if you can get it. Amanda?
I just thinking about economic risk, thinking about kind of the intent of this pillar, which was to capture vulnerability to climate change. Just kind of want to revisit what climate risks or events we're talking about and see if we think we've captured major vulnerabilities to them. So I guess in my mind, I think of vulnerability to temperature rises. Are there some areas where they might see a bigger increase in temperature than others because of landscape ecosystem, vegetative cover, the coastal location, vulnerability to extreme weather, and sea level rise. So kind of those three things: temperature change, extreme weather, sea level rise. Just curious if those kind of capture in your mind kind of the main climate risks, and then maybe we could talk about whether we're capturing major vulnerabilities to them. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, and you mentioned air quality here.
And I think we'll have that covered. It's the intersection, I think, that will be very interesting to, you know, some of those different elements, air quality, also these 2 to 3 cross pillars. So population health, mobility, I think will be a very good one. Children and families, we can actually capture with some of these other here. But to Amanda's point, you know, we don't need to be wedded to these exact things, but we do need to make sure that we're capturing that pillar and making sure that what we do have can capture the spirit of that pillar.
Go ahead, Sonal.
Hi. One thing I'm thinking about, and maybe this is just not something that will work, but you know, infectious disease rise with climate change, especially in a place like New York, whose climate is changing in terms of what is hospitable and not hospitable where we are now. And so that leads me to obviously think about the COVID-19 pandemic and maybe what data from what we're seeing of who's getting impacted there can be informing this this pillar, and how that can help us kind of predict communities that are going to be impacted with this in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Amanda, did you have anything to add?
That's something, Neil might have something to add here too, but I don't want to put anyone in this spot. I guess we started to investigate this, and it sounds like, you know, there certainly is a lot of data, but it sounded like the way it was tracked or recorded, it kind of considered like an open case or an open data set at this point, and there's still a lot of cases being investigated, so it might not be immediately ready. Neil, how would you describe that? Is that accurate?
That sounds right. As of the last time that we kind of talked about that. I mean, I think the other thing is, you know, we're in terms of infectious disease as it applies to like vector-borne disease. That's definitely something we think about with climate change. Some of the issues with the data is that, you know, we're usually on geography based on a person's place of residence, which isn't always where they were exposed, so to speak. So some of the things we wrestle with, but we could think about that a little bit more, for sure.
And as far as exposure, it might be less about exposure in this case. I mean, one of the things that we could get from the COVID data that could be good, because it disproportionately impacted Black and Latino residents, that it actually might show a bit of an intersection across multiple areas here as far as like pillars 2 and 3. I don't know. It'd be worthwhile trying to tinker with the data or see what is there. And even if it's not ready for this instantiation, that it could be brought in later in looking at those.
I think that kind of approach where maybe we were to come up with, you know, indicators, and then, as you said, Alex, bring in the COVID data later. That I think might make a lot of sense. Yeah. As a future direction. Yeah.
Yeah. As with all things, the messy things, this isn't the only time that this model will be cracked open and messed with. We just want to build it good enough now to set the guidance and then add to it and recognize the places where I think that this data set, this COVID data set could actually be really, really informative later once it actually gets created.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you guys have all made it through like 2 hours and 41 minutes. And I'm seeing the lag of things. One of the things I want to do, I think, Rosa, is take for each pillar the indicators and like just create these tables of like, here's what passes and here's what doesn't pass kind of thing, so that people can comment on them. Again, with if I'm going to ask each of you to like hold the whole idea of, it doesn't have to be exactly these concepts, but it's more of like, does this capture pillar 3? Do these capture pillar 3? And if not, what's missing and how can we find them? So what I'll do is build out these tables for each of these different ones, each of these different kind of gray areas for the pillars. so that you can see which ones pass versus don't. And then I think we can proceed, but I would like to hear from you if you think that this is far enough for us to start taking these particularly and downloading these data points and starting to create the data set. So what we really need to be doing now is starting to get our hands dirty with the data and seeing how things build. And so if you are all okay with it, you know, we want to be expansive here, grab these and then see for those that aren't at the geographic level at this point, whether we can manipulate the data to integrate them in. But we need to start running with at least these 43 or a subset of these if, you know, we don't need 7 race and ethnicity measures. We just need a couple. Same with air quality. We don't need 5. So would you all be open to that?
Alex, this is Jared again. Just curious, what's the methodology behind like filtering out indicators when you have multiple, for example?
In this case, this is Jared, like when you talk to your constituents, those experts, and they say, well, like of the 3, this is the one that's the best measure. Then we'll look at that one. We're probably going to download all 3. And with race and ethnicity, on all honesty, we'll probably look at each of these and see, because they're just little different definitions of it. 5. But for air quality, we know, let me show you. Let me just figure out what I need to get rid of as far as a thing here. Is here instead of here. We go to air quality. We have these that all pass. And so which ones are the better ones? So there's benzene, formaldehyde, summer seasonal average, annual particulate matter, and then I think the diesel particulate matter. So that's when we want to start going in and seeing which ones, based on the experts, are the good ones for us to be looking at and thinking through, and which ones are less good. I'm not averse to downloading all of them and creating the database with all of them. I'm really not. I just don't want us to like try to go through data reduction with 20 million different things. But I'm okay with us just building this out and starting to see where the data are. To that point, let me wow you with something that Amanda made that I grabbed and pulled in here. But this is what we've asked our analysts to do, is pulling things in and starting to assess the data that we have. Because, you know, we still don't know what the actual data look like, right? We're just trying to whittle down to get them. So once we get the data, we start looking. This is a mock-up, so don't, you know, mock up. You know, we want to see what the distribution looks like and how many missing values are there. And then what do things look like within New York City versus not, and start looking at the distribution this way and seeing whether, once we have other ones, how does it correlate with other elements in the different kind of core pillars and other things. And so what we want to do is start pulling those in and assessing it that way. And what we want to create as the first set is this snapshot for all the things we download. And then we start, you know, sharing it with you and overwhelming you with more data. But at least within this pretty visual way of saying like, okay, well, here's what this looks like. So we start just digging into the data in a very descriptive way. Amanda, you may take a bow now.
So I think if we don't have any other discussion around what Alex presented so far, I heard a couple of next steps from what she was saying. Alex is going to pull together those pillar analysis of what was above average and what was not for us to send to the working group members for your evaluation and feedback. We also have the task and step list that we are looking to you all again for your feedback on how well we are capturing what we need to do to help support your decision making for this working group. And then if you have not filled out the poll for our scheduling, please do that today so that we can get those on our calendars. And the other next step is for the state to get that meeting with California finalized as well for you all as a working group meeting. Any other next steps that I've missed?
I want to just overtly say that we want to start downloading the data and crunching and starting to do this. It doesn't mean that we're stuck with just these 43. It doesn't mean that we're stuck with just these 77 or whatever, but that we are pushing the timeline forward as far as like getting that database created so we can continue to see how it goes.
And could I ask, the nice visuals, I think that's going to be really helpful. Thank you, Amanda, for creating those. Will it be possible, in addition to the kind of New York City upstate, to look at that in terms of urban, suburban, and rural?
Yeah, that's doable. I think we can kind of start thinking about different ways of doing that. So if you have any thoughts, but are you going to do urban, rural, suburban, rural, and looking at the distribution that way and what it covers. And again, just to point out how important it is to get your thoughts on all of this. We are in no way experts on all of these things, and we also need your activism and thoughts on so that we're not missing anything as we're trying to like push this boat forward. Recipe, biscuits, whatever I used before. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because we're done sharing crazy amount of data.
Great, thanks, Alex, and thank you, everyone. We've got our next steps outlined. I will be following up with you all with the recording once it's available, and usually it doesn't take too long to get that posted. The draft minutes from today will also be sent to you, but the first priority is getting you the pillar breakout that Alex is putting together and the task list that we previewed for you today for your input. And with that, thank you again for participating in this very long session with us. I think we had a lot of great discussion and know our path forward from here. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
We appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Bye.
afternoon.